The UV line layer is not only useful as a reference for where the polygons are as part of the UV map, but also it can be used to add and enhance the existing texture. There's a lot of different ways you can use it, and if you've got a UV map from an application other than Cinema that doesn't produce the UV line where it's opaque, where it's just the lines, you can draw out your own just using the line tool, just outlining it on a new layer. I did do a little bit of cleanup because there were those top lines from basically where the roof polygons were, or what could be the roof polygons in a more reduced layer. So I did just go ahead and delete those. I also want to note that the angled or any line that isn't perfectly vertical or horizontal may not be strong enough. So what you can do is just create a duplicate of the layer and then merge it down. And that will enhance the overall line and thicken it up a bit if needed. A lot of different things we could do. If we wanted to just kind of accent the edges, we could first I'm going to go ahead and make a duplicate because I don't want to get rid of this layer. Open the layer style, add a stroke, and set it to white. We can increase the size a little. And then add another layer, putting it underneath just a blank layer. Select both of them and merge them down. So this way we have the stroke become part of the main layer. Then what we can do is use one of the textures. I'm going to go back to distort. At the moment, it looks like it's a little difficult to see. So I'm going to invert, just Control I, invert the layer so it's black, so that while we're working with the filters, we'll be able to actually see what's going on and what's happening. In this case, it looks like it's not going to do anything because there is no background layer. And it won't modify or mix because it's transparent. So in this case, what you might want to do is merge it with another layer underneath to fill. Basically, it's just because it has transparency. Some of the filters will not work if they have, or if the layer has a certain amount of transparency, because it uses the overall layer to kind of mix. So in this case, I'm going to go back and invert it again, bring it back where it was, add a new layer, bring it underneath, and use the paint bucket tool to paint black. Now I can merge this together, go into the filter, go back to distort, and now we're going to see the distortion, because it does need a kind of mix in order to create the roughness. So if we want to just kind of accent the edges, we could apply the glass distortion, set it to lighten, and then just reduce the opacity amount, or even create a mask out of this. Now in this case, this is just going to be not look very good because it does take more continuous effects and blends with other layers. I just wanted to show you that it is there to be modified. It also is very helpful, and I'm just going to go ahead and delete this, for creating an ambient occlusion or baked occlusion layer. So that would be something you would run depending on the application you're using. You could have it as a subtractant on an ambient light channel. If you don't have that option, it would just be something you add to the diffusion. What you can do is reduce the fill to 0 use drop shadow and make sure that layer knocks out drop shadow is checked off, and that way it won't create a line. But you can use this to generate an occlusion around certain parts of the map. Now if you don't want it to show in the vertical areas, basically around the corners, then you would have to delete those lines, but just keep the top lines outlining just underneath the roof, and you can really create some nice variations within the map that way and create better diffusion, even modifying the color that way. Doing a color burn around the edges can enhance the map a little bit more, or you could lighten it, set an exclusion, set that to white, and kind of run in a reverse effect where the details are more diminished around the edges. So a lot of different ways you could use the UV layer besides just as a reference. Kind of cool. So as you can see, I did add a few additional textures to add some more color and a little more grit and grime to the overall map. I've also modified the windows and the door. Just a very simple operation style, basically using a stroke set to pattern, and then just kind of overlaid the pattern, set it to exclusion to subtract from the edges, and that way I was able to kind of create a little bit of a frame. And just underneath that, I modified the outer glow to be black, set the blend mode to normal, so it works more like a drop shadow without the distance. And that way it does separate it a little bit more from the rest of the texture. So we're going to break this down into our individual maps, and I'm going to start by opening the history and creating a new document from the current state. Going ahead, flatten that. I can also open basically the material channel I had before. So the wall material. So big improvement from where it was before. And just we can duplicate the layer over, or Control A to select all, Control C to copy, and then paste that in, where I can then just merge it down, and now it's called color. Depending on whether or not you select the other layer, depends on whether or not the name is carried over. So if I was to select both of these and merge down, it's now called layer 1. Undo that, select layer 1, hit Control E, and now it's going to take the name of the layer underneath it. So that can save you some time if you are in fact working with the layered material and kind of updating it the way I am. So if we save this out, we can reload within Cinema to see it updated, just selecting the material and reload image. And now we're going to see that color map updating, and I just kind of guessed where the door should be, and it looks like I got it really close, which is good. I do maybe want to have a little bit more space. For the most part that should be fine. I can just lift up the building model, because we are going to be basically adjusting the pivot point to reach that center area. I also want to take the material, go to the editor, and increase the size of the texture to get a better preview, making sure that I am using the enhanced OpenGL so it looks the best. That's also going to show the normal maps and the bump maps, diffusion, all the different material channel layers once we get those saved out. So back in Photoshop, we can delete that duplicate, and we're going to create first, save out a new version of this template and basically call it Diffuse. And that way I can work with individual templates for creating specific maps. I'll also have another one for the normal, and if needed, the bump. So this way we can make modifications because we're going to be using the black and white filter in order to remove the color because we don't need to have the color for the diffusion. Unless you're using an application that will use color for diffusion and set up kind of automatic highlights. So now we need to decide which elements should be controlled or diffused and which should remain just part of color, because we can in fact use the color as a diffusion within the color channel when using Cinema, which is pretty nice. There is a technique for that, and I'll be showing once we go ahead and save all these out. So I'm going to go ahead and just turn off some of my blending layers. I don't really think they need to be part of the diffusion. I might want to keep one or two of them on. For the most part, you may not need some of those different color layers. So we can now go into each of these maps where we have the windows. And if you need to, you can copy the layer style and paste it onto the diffuse. And that way you still have the outline and shading, because that should be part of the diffusion for the most part. It may not be necessary, but you never know what could happen with the look of the texture if it's just part of the color. So we just go around the windows and just pasting that layer style, turning off the color, and then doing the same thing for the door. Copy layer style from the door color, paste it onto the diffusion, and then we can turn off the bump and the color. And that's really only if you're using existing textures that have these additional channels. If not, you can just set up the black and white filter, which is what I'm going to show you right now, and just use the same process on the color maps. So I'm going to start just with this one of my overlays, adjustments, so image adjustments, black and white, and then we can control the output based on the color. So that's pretty cool, and that way we can add a bit more diffusion. You can also use some of the masks in order to generate some nice diffusion. Really, diffusion will vary depending on the program that you're using. Certain applications will produce an entirely different effect depending on the diffusion map. So whether or not you're affecting the specular color or just darkening the texture itself. So I'm just going to go through every single one of the layers and just go through to adjust each of these values for black and white. You may not have to fine-tune every single one, but sometimes it is nice to add that extra little bit of precision in there. Very simple maps, you could easily just hit Control-Shift-U, which will just desaturate them if they really don't have much color. That's basically the same as going to Adjustments, Hue and Saturation, and turning down the saturation all the way. Which before the black and white filter was one of the primary ways a lot of people would convert color to grayscale, which isn't always the best method. Once we get to the layers where there's large variations in the overall brightness or color, Then we might want to intensify the output, but also keeping in mind that we can adjust levels later, and this is really for a very specific color basis. And for the most part, you'll find yourself working with reds and yellows, or cyans and blues. Sometimes green and magenta, really depending on the image you're working with. Most photographs you'll find red and yellow and cyan very common. Or you'll have a red and cyan, or yellow and cyan, something like that, really depending on if the original image has been modified. Because from natural light, you'll find those colors very common for at least these types of maps. Another thing to keep in mind when you're making your diffusion maps is that any darkness or intensity of the color and the overall lume range of the color will be sometimes far too dark if you're using that same overall contrast to produce the diffusion. So you may need to lighten some of those up, or even just remove some of the overlays entirely. Also, you have the ability to adjust the levels, so Control L for levels, and you can brighten it up if you want, create variations. For the most part, a diffusion map should be fairly high contrast. We're just kind of working our way up to it right now. And right now, if I wanted to create a very intense separation, we can drag that middle slider more towards the right. If we start from the left, it's really going to increase the overall intensity of that. So if we didn't want it that intense, we could also reduce the black output, but still have that high contrast within the layer. There's a lot of different ways to get to where you need to be for the diffusion. And since we have kind of two primary layers for the back wall, we have this kind of smoother overlay and then the brick layers. We can also at a certain point merge them together, and merging the layers in order to modify them separately if needed. So there really are a lot of ways to get different results. So I'm just going to continue doing a few more adjustments to the diffusion. Basically just right now modifying, removing color, and then we'll take a look at condensing it. Not only is it a good idea to obviously go in and make changes to the overall variation, but since we have a lot of layer styles, we can really pick up and generate more by now increasing the opacity amounts of these layer styles and using different methods, setting up distance, because we don't want an exact match to the color map. We do want a little more variation overall. So you can go through any of your layers that have layer style set up and pull out a lot more detail in the final map just by increasing opacity and or sometimes even decreasing it, depending on what kind of look you're going for. But we're basically just subtracting from the light. So we'll go through and continue that. We're getting very close to being done. And now I'm just modifying the levels of that original exclusion layer that I set up back when we first started on the color map, and increasing the contrast of that layer. It's always a good idea to turn the preview on and off to really see the impact. If you were to use this more for the color of it and we don't want it to affect the diffusion, then you can just turn the layer off. So we could easily just turn that layer off if needed. So before we even merge everything together as part of this set, it is a good idea to create a duplicate and take a look at the current progress, because otherwise it's going to be difficult to get back to where you were. And this main wall texture, we basically have right now inner shadow. I am going to turn back on the drop shadow, go back into the style, and in the inner shadow, increase the intensity of the color burn. If we increase the choke too much, it's going to make everything pretty much black. So we do need to watch to make sure we're not making it too large. But also keeping in mind that everything above a certain point is going to be cut out, and we don't need to focus on every part of the image. Just within the UV bounds. So that's getting fairly interesting. I am going to increase the overall lightness of this layer. And one thing I want to do for the windows is to take the drop shadow. So let's go ahead and just zoom in here and increase that, because I do want more diffusion around the windows. So I'm going to copy the layer style and then paste it onto the other diffusions and the other windows. And then we're going to take a look at how this diffusion map is going to work. I also need to do kind of an overall contrast once this is flattened. But I'm going to save this out so that we have the layered version. Go to history, create a duplicate from the current state, and flatten the image. Click OK. And now we can adjust. Go to levels, click auto, just to start with, which will clip out some of the ranges that aren't being used. And we can modify the diffusion at this point to adjust the center point. We can cut out certain areas, cut out the higher points or the lower points. I think all I really want to do right now is just set up that auto, because I don't want to lose any of that information, and we can easily adjust the contrast of this map within Cinema, or just come back and modify it later. So first I just want to see where we're at with the current state. So I am going to, let's just right click, duplicate the layer onto that material, and we'll call this diffuse. I'm going to go ahead and save it out. So now we can go into Cinema, and with the material we can select the color channel, we can select the texture, right click and copy. Now turn on diffusion, right click on that texture and paste. Because it is a TIFF layer, we can select the texture and select the layer set and then choose the diffusion. The diffuse amount is set to normal at the moment, and I think what I'd like to do is reduce the brightness of the overall diffusion to a little over 70, and then we can reduce the total impact of this diffusion. And what I was talking about before with using the color to also add more to the diffusion, if we change the mix mode to subtract and keeping the color close to white or gray, we can reduce the brightness, and the more we increase the brightness, the more of a contrast we get out of the color. And it works quite well back and forth with the diffusion. So that's a neat little trick. Just using the subtract mode, I'm going to set that color to white. So now we're just seeing the diffusion and the color. And it's a very dirty looking surface. Because we don't really have any lighting set up and we don't have the normal yet, there's really no point in tweaking a lot of the different settings, because adjusting the normal is really going to create a huge impact. One thing we can do is go to the specular, increase the width and the height, and change it over to colored. Because we don't want to have it have any major specular value. Just an overall nice diffusion. We can also go ahead at this point and add in an infinite light. So adding basically a sunlight. We could also use the sunlight, but I'm just going to start with infinite light and just kind of adjust the rotation. So we can get a little bit of a better look at this. And do a quick render. And overall, I think it's starting to look pretty good. So now we're going to move over. Just stick with that diffusion for now. I can increase some of the effects and also use that UV outline layer to add a little bit more to it. So I think what I am going to do is go back really quick and take the UV mesh layer, turn on the drop shadow, make sure the layer is not knocking out the drop shadow, and we can add a little bit of faked occlusion. So now once again, just go into history, duplicate state, and flatten it. Duplicate the layer over to the material, and Control L for levels, auto, OK, and then Control E to merge it down, save it. If you want, you can go back to Cinema, select that material for the diffusion, and reload the image. Provided the layer name has not changed, then it shouldn't replace anything. It looks like it did mess with the color slightly. So we do just have to select or reselect that color layer. But now it's established with that colored name. Before, it may not have been originally selected that way, so it shouldn't replace it in the future.